New Jersey copies New York's post-Bruin gun carry restrictions, plus Gun Violence Archive's Mark Bryant on his role in the CDC's gun defense use drama. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free newsletter today if you want to keep updated on the latest in gun news across America. You can also purchase a membership if you want to support our reporting. That is how we fund our journalism here at The Reload, and you can find out all the details for that over at thereload.com. This week, we are talking about the CDC defensive gun use situation. We actually have somebody who was involved directly in the conversations that led to the CDC changing how they describe the issue on their website. And that is Mark Bryant, who's the executive director of the Gun Violence Archive. Thank you so much for being with us today, Mark. Can you just tell people a little bit more about yourself before we get going?
Well, I'm the executive director of the group. We have been around since 2013. Prior to that, I was a systems analyst for IBM, worked with various technology companies, primarily as a contractor for the last 35, 40 years.
All right. And Gun Violence Archive has become pretty well known, pretty influential in media since you guys launched in 2013. So we'll also get into, I think, some of the discussions over how you guys measure things, methodology, and we can go back and forth on that after we talk about the CDC situation. But so starting with the CDC situation, you were involved in a series of conversations and a meeting with the agency last year in the summertime, where you were advocating for change to how they describe defensive gun uses on their Fast Facts website, sort of the website where if somebody's going to Google CDC and defensive gun use, that's probably where they're going to end up in terms of, it gives you sort of a starting point, I think is supposed to be the idea. And the CDC initially resisted this idea, but then I guess was convinced to make this change. Why don't you just lay out in your own words what your concerns were with how the CDC had handled things previous to this?
I was brought in last. So I was what I call the second wingman. Although most of the articles regarding this issue have put me at the forefront of it, whatever. I can deal with that. But what the initial issue was that the CDC's numbers are not their numbers, but their paragraph addressed extrapolations on estimates of gun use, of defensive gun use. And I have no problem with that. I think that is a reasonable thing for them to do. I think where we had an issue, GVA, and where the GVP folks had an issue was that there were several numbers that were listed, and one was an outlier. The 2.5 million from Gary Kleck's study from 1993, much higher than everyone else. So we were concerned that it causes issues. And the reasoning for that is we would say if gun violence prevention folks were advocating and saying there needs to be some regulation for how things are, how we look at saving lives, then all of a sudden this $2.5 million defensive gun use number was thrown out, and it just stifled the conversation because it was like, oh my God, we're saving. Look how many lives we're saving, and our concern was that number has never been proven. That number has never once been critically looked at by the right-hand side of this discussion. Now, Harvard's looked at it. Johns Hopkins has looked at it. A lot of research PhDs have looked at this number, and they all consider it bad. They don't consider it a good number. It is, I wrote it down, 41 times higher than the next set of numbers. So, so if you look at the three estimates, that the CDC had from 60,000 to 2.5 million, that is a 41 times spread. Now, if you were looking at numbers for polling, for whatever the issue is, you would have a question if something was such an outlier that it was 41 times higher. And that's all that we did. We were going, that number just it seems suspect. So why have it in there if it is suspect?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, obviously your criticism focused a lot on that 2.5 million number. And we will certainly get into the sort of statistical critiques that you guys had for why you don't like that estimate. But you're calling it an outlier there, and obviously there is a massive range between the 60,000 and 2.5 million. That is the range that the CDC gave on the website initially, and was part of the reason why the concerns that they expressed in comments about this. But when you say it's an outlier, there have been a number of other surveys that indicated between 1 million and 2.5 million defensive gun uses per year in the United States as well, including just recently one from Georgetown University professor William English that found 1.6 million among gun owners, people who identify as gun owners. So I guess, can you talk a little bit more about why you consider Gary Kleck's research particularly troubling, or do you just have a problem with all survey-based defensive gun use estimates?
No, not at all. I think that, that people use different methodologies. And so I have no problem with, let's look at the methodologies. And we'll talk about methodologies of what GVA does later, which is very much important to me. So what I look at is if a number is so far out of the range, and the other studies you're looking at, I would have to ask the question, have they been proofed? Has anyone proven that number? Has anybody on the gun rights side take a critical look at those numbers? Now, they're numbers that make your argument easier, but if you don't look at them critically and you don't ask for proof on those numbers, you're starting to look at some issues of credibility, because you're picking up a number that you don't have any proof is even remotely correct.
Mm-hmm. And this was obviously what was articulated in those emails that we reported on from you and also from GVpedia founder
Devin Hughes.
Devin Hughes, yes. Apologies for his name slipped my mind for a moment. But this is the sort of main statistical critique of Gary Kleck's work, right? That if there were, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but the idea is if there were 2.5 million defensive gun uses per year, you should be able to verify some percentage of that through observable evidence like police reports or media reports. That's
sure. Yeah.
That's your basic argument, right?
Well, that's the basic argument of statistics. You should be able to prove X amount, sometimes extrapolations work extremely well. If I'm trying to determine who's going to be the next president, I can tag 5,000 people. I can ask them what their point of view is, who they're going to vote for. And with a margin of error of about 2 or 3%, I can come up with a number that is fairly accurate. Now, if I look at a number that says there's a 4-point spread, and the next number says there's a 9-point spread, and the next one says there's a 1,400-point spread, you're going to be dubious of that 1,400-point spread. And that's all we're saying. We're not saying that academic research should not occur. We think that defensive gun use is an important variable that has to be looked at in this gun discussion that we're having nationally. But we just don't think that when you have a number that is an outlier, and it is, that's an issue.
Right. And look, to me, as we talked about on last week's episode, where we dove into some of these concepts and how people try to measure defensive gun use, there is certainly an open conversation about what the right way to go about doing this is. And there are going to be both strengths and weaknesses to each approach, to your approach or to Gary Kleck's approach or the approach of other people using surveys. One thing I'm interested in is what would you consider to be verification of a survey-based estimate? Like how much, if you're talking about millions per year in defensive gun uses in these surveys, how many would you expect to? I mean, it seems like, so you guys at GVA have identified something around 2,000 per year.
And we know that number is
verified.
Low. And we know that number is low.
Right. But so I guess your point seems to be we're only finding 2,000 of these incidents that make it into media reports or police reports. And we'll get into, how that side of it in a moment. But how many would you want to find if you were really if there were really 2.5 million per year?
Let's look at it this way. Let's kind of break that number down, because the 2.5 million suggests a lot of different things. It suggests that there are 2.5 million. Now, Kleck and Lott both say, well, most of the time these are not reported.
Right.
Okay, so they are taking a number that they don't know, because if they say they don't know how many were not reported, then they're taking a number that they just don't know, and they're trying to factor that in. Okay, so let's factor that in. Let's give it the benefit of the doubt and try to factor it in. How many is most? Let them answer that. If they say most aren't reported, how can you justify having a number if the very first disclaimer that you throw on top of it is, well, we really can't count it? So if, I want to see on a 2.5 million number, you should have an expectation of X number of people shot, X number of people killed, X number of police reports. You should have a substantial, if you got 2.5 million defensive gun uses, you're going to have more than 2,000 that show up on police reports. That's just.
Well, let's get into the police report question real quick.
Sure.
So I'm interested in your methodology here. You guys, You say that you use media reports and police reports.
Right.
I've looked through the archive. I haven't looked at every single one.
Right.
But the vast majority of them seem to be media reports. Is that accurate?
And if you go back 3 years and 4 years, there were not nearly as many law enforcement sites that easily made their data available. So yeah, if you go back, most of our stuff was media back then. But you have to realize that every media report starts with a police report. It starts with somebody hearing something on the scanner, or it starts with somebody knowing that someone's been shot. And so all of that, it is all the trickle down of events. So it all starts with the police report. Some people blow off, oh, it was just a media report. Well, that media report didn't come out of thin air. And you know as well as I do, media does not just make up events for their 6 o'clock news. They have enough that are already there that they don't have to make any up. So everything starts with either a media report and then taking a police report to add detail, or start with a police report and look at the media report to add texture. Because while the media report will have some bit of information, the police report will have others. And so between the two of them, you get a lot better textured information.
But I guess the main problem with this approach, to me at least, seems to be that you wouldn't capture a lot of defense. This is sort of one of the things the CDC initially said about your approach as well. But so as far as police reports go, what police reports do you have access to? Because, I mean, we can see right now, even an agency like the FBI has trouble gathering police reports from local police, right?
We look at the top 100,
huge problem, but
yeah, you're right. We look at the top 150 cities. And from those top 150 cities, we can survey police department what their annual reports are, what their quarterly reports are, and we can see what they have that is listed, how they list it. Do they not? Do some of them not list defensive gun uses? Yes, that's correct. They do not. And so you can't count those.
But some of them do. They have a category.
And some of them do, and we count them.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah. So, there's a And there's also a bit of a misconception that we only count if somebody has been shot or killed, and that's not the case. We will count a defensive gun use even if it is, somebody goes out into their front yard and waves a gun at a car thief. It's to scare him off. Now, where I have a problem personally is the gun rights folks. And I apologize for clumping gun rights folks together. We can talk about the statistics of that in a little bit. But the gun rights folks like to say that, most of these aren't reported. But we also like to say that we have really good people. These are good, straightforward, honest, patriotic American people. Yes, most are. So I'm befuddled when you have a person that is stealing cars and you have thought that it's sufficient enough of a threat to yourself, your family, or your possessions to present lethal force that you would then turn around and ignore calling the police. Basically, what you're saying is that, well, my problem's over. I got rid of it. He can go down the road and do whatever he wants. And that's a selfish move. And I just don't think I don't think it's accurate, which is why I don't think there's nearly as many we don't report it as some people like to say there are.
Right. And this is
I have more trust in gun owners. I have a lot more trust in the honor and ethics of gun owners than to believe a majority of 2.5 million don't call the cops.
And this was what I described as dismissive in my story, was this part of your described methodology.
Sure.
And let me explain why I view it that way. Because I understand where you're coming from as far as like, if you are in a situation where you fear for your life because someone is presenting a threat to you, you should call the police, right? That seems like a base level, obvious thing, right? But there's a couple problems with that. One, I'll just give you an anecdote. I know you're a data guy, but I'll give you an anecdote about a real life scenario that I experienced years ago with an ex-girlfriend. She lived in Old Town Alexandria, very nice area of Virginia, and someone came and tried to get into her apartment while she was home. I was actually on the phone with her at the time this happened, but it's a very scary situation, right? And I told her to hang up and call the police, and I got my gun and rushed there. Luckily, she had her own firearm, and went and got her firearm, yelled at the person that she had a gun and that and to leave. It's not it's not their apartment. They can't come in there. And luckily, the person did. They ran off. The police came. She never saw. This was through she had a direct door to her apartment from the outside, and it was sort of a tinted glass or shaded glass, so you can't see in or out. But you can see that there's a person there, and you could hear them trying to get in. Called the police. Police came. Person ran off. No shots fired. I'm sure the police took some sort of report, but how does an incident like that end up in your database, for instance? Do you think it would?
It would if the police document it correctly. If they document it only as a shots fired, no injury call.
So there are no shots fired.
Well, okay, but also do not mention the defensive use, that it was a person that warned a bad guy that they had a gun and to please step away. If they warn them, then and that should be in the police report. And if it is, it's counted. That's the thing. But the interest in your anecdote is that the police were called.
Sure.
So that's a good thing.
Yeah, certainly. And my anecdote, the police were called. Many times the police may not be called in a scenario like that because you don't have much, or they might not respond either if you call them after the fact.
Sure.
Because there's not much information to give them. You don't have a description of the suspect. Someone comes, I believe this is the scenario that CDC had put forth internally when they were discussing your, the concerns that you guys had. somebody comes onto your property late at night. You don't necessarily get a description of them. You present a gun, tell them to leave. They leave. You call the police. What are the police going to do? I just am very skeptical that would even end up in data that you can access. And on top of this, right, the William English survey from last year, right, which addressed a number of the outstanding concerns with Kleck's work, or some of the common critiques of them. Like, for instance, I think this was brought up as well. Kleck asked people if they'd been in a defensive gun use encounter over the previous year, and there was critique that people might not be remembering correctly. It might have been more than a year ago. There's issues with that arise with that. William English did his study differently, asked over the course of your life if you'd been involved in a defensive gun use, and then used the average age of the people involved to calculate the yearly stats. There were a couple things that he addressed in that way. It was a larger survey, more people responded to it. Just representative sample in every state. There were a number of things that were different about it, but it came out to the same basic results, which was more than. Now it was 1.6 to be fair. Kleck's is 2.5.
And I see that
there's a number of differences.
The last thing that Kleck has doubled down to 5.2.
Well, Kleck will give a different. Kleck, if you read the original surveys, has a different measure for depending on what factors you take into place.
Yes.
And if you think that perhaps people are overrepresenting when they're legally defending themselves versus illegally using a gun against someone, he has different calculations based on different factors to look at the results. But the point with the English study isn't just that it's addresses some of the common critiques of Kleck's, but also he asked how many people how many rounds were fired for each incident. And I believe it was over 80% had no rounds fired at all. Mm-hmm. And I do think that in a scenario where no rounds are fired and no harm comes to anyone, mm-hmm. it's much less likely that a police report is going to be filed for just so many different reasons, including, for instance, the relationship between police and the community where self-defense encounter occurs, right? I mean, I don't know that there's a lot of young minorities who are going to be calling up the police to tell them they used a gun in self-defense if they don't have to.
Yeah, where snitches get stitches.
Or just like
what you're, and that's
a lot of people aren't going to want to call the police if nothing has happened and they had to use a gun for self-defense because they might worry that they'll get in trouble for something. There's a lot of reasons why you might call.
And everything you said, I don't argue with, but it brings us up back to the original question of most people do not report it. Mm-hmm. We need to define most. There needs to be an understanding of what most is. Because most might be 50,000. That's a big number. Yeah. And it might be 2 million. Mm-hmm. But if you can't come up with a number that even remotely proofs that, where are you? You're using a number that just can't be justified. What if I were to say, and let me back up for a second. Back when GVA started, one of the things that I looked at was I was doing some blog stuff, and I was looking at numbers from both the right-hand side of the aisle and from the left-hand side of the aisle. And both of them were making up numbers like crazy. Both of them were making things up. So when the folks at whatever GVP group would say that there were 150,000 children shot last year, your side of the equation will go, you can't, there's no way. That's not true. There's no way that's the case. You look at all the police reports and there's not that many kids shot. I saw those arguments. We saw those arguments 10, 12 years ago. Mm-hmm. And now today, you're ignoring that argument. Not you specifically, but the right-hand side is ignoring that. They're going, oh, well, maybe in that case, but not in this case. So
Yeah, I understand
that's why we like to have
critique.
quantitative numbers rather than
Sure.
guesstimates.
Yeah, and look, I don't
That's
think
all
that
we asked. That's all we asked the CDC to do. You look at what their answer was, and all they did not blow out just defensive gun use. They didn't say it does not exist. They just said there's a widespread of data and it needs more study.
Yeah, they kind of changed it from. So let me get into why I think the change itself is as innocuous as the new language is. Like that, yeah, they didn't endorse, GVA's count or what have you.
And we did not ask them
it's
to.
innocuous. Sure,
we did not ask them to.
Right, and that's fair. You did ask them to remove, to just put something a placeholder, which is what they ended up doing.
What we asked them to do was either come up with their own study,
right,
and come up with an honest number, or take guesstimates away that were misleading.
Right. That is what you asked them to. Yes.
Yes.
Now so my point is that not that the GVA archive on defensive gun uses is should be shut down or is bad data or anything like that. My takeaway or my thought on this is you're probably capturing most high profile incidents. That's what
the ones
where
someone shot or killed. Yes.
Sure. And even occasionally when there's no one injured, I believe Robert Verbruggen, maybe you have these numbers. Robert Verbruggen said he looked through the last year's data and 4% of them were incidents where no one was injured. And the rest had injuries.
I think it was a lot closer to 50%. I think 50%. Most of that. I think most of our DGUs are 0.
Oh, sorry. It may be no shots fired. I apologize.
Maybe, okay, I would go with that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's where I feel like maybe there isn't as much conflict between these two ways of measuring as it may seem at first, because again, in English's version, 80% or more than 80% of people reported not having to fire a shot at all. To me, there seems to be a way where collecting data on incidents that make it into the news or into police reports, the limited police reports that you have access to, that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. And one way of measuring this sort of thing, but you're capturing a different, you would tend to capture most of the high profile examples of defensive gun use. And then how do you capture the rest of them? Well, the only other way I could imagine is by just asking people directly whether they've ever been involved. And that does result in both of these approaches have their strengths and weaknesses. So my issue with the CDC change is that the CDC wasn't really endorsing anything in their old description. They said 60 to 2.5 because that's what this various studies out there had produced. The 60,000 number comes from the National Crime Victimization Survey, which has its own issues,
yes,
from the fact that they're asking people who self-identify as victims of crime whether they used a gun and they don't actually ask them if they used a gun. It's just, did you do something? And if they volunteer that they used a gun, then that's what gets counted. There's a lot of, there's critiques to all of these different approaches. And, I feel that putting in that estimate, and then they give you a link to a paper that the CDC had commissioned. Now, it is from 2013, so I understand that it's a little bit older, and it'd be great if the CDC could update that paper or something along those lines. I know that was something that you put in as a possible example, but it just doesn't seem, it wasn't as though they endorsed Kleck's work. They just said, here's what the range is, and here's a paper to read more about this stuff. And now they've gone to a statement that says, science is hard. Maybe someday we'll have better numbers, which seems like a step back to me. But obviously I know for you that's probably, you think the 2.5 is too misleading to be in there at all, right? That's your basic? I
think that's really my personal basic issue. If I did the same thing, if I did an extrapolation to tell you that there were 150,000 kids shot a year, you'd be on my butt in a heartbeat. The right-hand side, you and the other and the other gun rights blogs would be on me like crazy if I were to come up with an extrapolation like that and then go, well, I can't really prove that number, but that's my number and I'm justifying it. And the people on the GVP side go, yeah, that's a correct number. Well, that's not right either. They should be scrutinizing me just as well. So maybe what we need to talk about is the fact, why does the left scrutinize the right's number and not scrutinize left's number? And why does the bloggers on the right fail to scrutinize numbers on the right and just take them as solid? Now, that's all confirmation bias issues, but
Sure.
you got to admit you didn't do any research
Sure.
to collect. I read the articles that you wrote, and I read some other ones, and it was like, let's throw Kleck some softballs and let him say anything he wants, and then let's pound on the other side. Evidently, I forgot what you said, and what everybody else said as well. We coerced. Was it coerced? What was the word you said that we did to the CDC?
Lobbied? Well, I think that the Trace called it lobbying.
I guess. So my question is, do you also give that kind of scrutiny to the NRA's lobbying? About
Yes, I think if you read the reload,
$200 million worth of lobbying in the last 20 years, and all we did was ask for a paragraph to have a change to be more clear.
Sure. I mean, I think if you read the reload, you'll see we scrutinize the NRA quite a lot around here. But
but you see what I'm saying.
Yes, but I will say too,
most folks are not going to protect the NRA, and they're not going to ever look at the why they lobby and what they lobby for and all that. But you pound on us.
Sure. Well, I will say that if I do believe that, look, there's obviously a level of partisanship involved in sort of tribalism involved in why each side doesn't scrutinize themselves more.
Sure.
I don't know that I would disagree that the reload is particularly
it's confirmation
guilty
bias
of that.
Issues. Yeah.
Sure. But I will say too, that if this story had been the opposite and it was, Wayne LaPierre and John Lott lobbying the CDC in private to make a change to their website because they didn't like the political impact of what was on there, it probably would have been an even bigger story, quite frankly.
Have you checked to see if they have or have not done
that? The CDC, I don't have any. This came from FOIA documents. So I don't have like any other.
You drew an
if somebody has evidence that they've done that,
Wayne LaPierre, you would have jumped on it. But
I would have, yes.
Okay, but you haven't checked to see if Wayne LaPierre and that group has done that.
That's a good question for another FOIA. I perhaps would be useful. I didn't actually do this FOIA.
I know you did.
It was performed by a gun rights lawyer. I just got the documents after the fact.
Sure.
So if anyone has evidence, something like that. The CDC did say that they talked to all kinds of groups. And so maybe we will get more information in that area. We don't have anything to that effect now.
Right.
And that's actually one of the things I wanted to get into because, we just went over the statistical arguments, the strengths and weaknesses of these various approaches. And I think there are legitimate criticisms of the survey-based DGU estimates and the sort of media police report-based estimates that you guys use at GBA, and I don't think that there's a perfect answer. I do, personally, the idea that there's only 2,000 or so defensive gun uses in a country with 120 million gun owners does strike me as counterintuitive.
Question: where did we get the 120 million gun owners?
120 million people who report having a gun in the home, according to the latest AP poll and Gallup.
Okay. So that number has gone up because it was at 60. It was at 60 a couple of years ago.
So you might be thinking of if you ask people directly if they are gun owners, you usually get a lower number of something like 35.
I think of the $50 million or 50 million gun owners number. That's the one that I've seen.
There's more people in the country now too. So
exactly. But I was just wondering where that 120 number came from.
Sure. Yeah. It was from how many people report having a gun in the home.
Gotcha. Okay.
Gun owners would be slightly lower, about 10 points lower.
Right.
10 percentage points. So, but you get the idea. A lot of people own guns.
No, I understand that. I have no issue with that.
So that's where like 2,000 per year.
Well, as we say in our
starts
thing,
to be.
as we say, we're very clear that we know that's not completely accurate, because we know there are those that are not reported.
Sure.
But the interesting part is we only started putting DGU in at the request of gun rights folks.
Okay. Sure. And look, I don't think there's anything wrong with you guys doing it the way you do it. And I think maybe the largest database of them. Is that right? I'm not, there may be some. Heritage does the same thing.
I know NRA sort of does our data, so I don't know. And I apologize. I didn't mean to talk over you there. So.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I appreciate you coming on and us being able to have a civil exchange about this stuff, because I'm interested in your point of view, and I appreciate you engaging. So, now the main criticism of all this is not necessarily over your statistical critiques of Gary Kleck's work. A lot of this stuff has been around since he did those surveys in the 90s, right? These questions. And I didn't see anything brand new in there as far as what you guys were saying to the CDC. But the main problem people have with it is that this happened in private. It involved both the White House and Senator Durbin's office connecting the CDC with you and Hughes, and then also, of course, the involvement of Poe Murray, who is, Devin Hughes and you are sort of try to stick more to
we're the data
research.
Yeah.
Poe Murray is much more of a traditional gun control activist, and really on the more bombastic side of things. She's commonly attacks people who are not in favor of assault weapons bans or AR-15 bans as being in favor of arming mass shooters and killing children. I don't say that I'm not paraphrasing. There's things she's literally said, including to one of a father who lost his daughter at Parkland. Mm-hmm. So, the way this came about with the CDC not seeking anyone else's input and doing it behind closed doors effectively was, I think, the source of the most criticism here. Do you find any issue with that process?
Let
do
me
you think they should have done
a little bit. I had no contact with anyone other than I was told, let's see, how'd it go? I was asked by Devin and Poe, hey, there's going to be a Zoom, and could you sit in on it and with your statistics on DGUs? That was it. I mean, if there was a deeper than that, I never saw it or heard it. I none. Now we have a tendency to we do not lobby, and as you and I talked about on an email exchange, I was talking about the statistics and whether the statistics are accurate. I don't really consider that lobbying. I could see where some others would, so I can back off myself and say I don't need to be lobbying because that's not my job.
Well, sure, and I understand. And you didn't seem to be involved in the initial conversation. I will say that from reading all the emails.
I was only at the very end, right at the Zoom meeting.
Okay, all right. So that is good clarity to have for everyone. But obviously, your comments strayed into more than just the data aspect. It strayed into the political impact of Gary Kleck's work, right? I mean, this was, you already mentioned it at the beginning of the show.
Sure.
I don't think you're disputing that. So, I mean, do you think people are wrong to be concerned about how this went?
Well, I think that, if you look at a statistic or a number that stops conversations or that stifles conversations, you got to be dubious of that number. Unless it's, if it can be proven, if Kleck could prove his number and how, I'm not sure. I think if he could come up with 25% of his number and prove it, I think people would shut up because they would go, okay, that was hard to do. And it brought that out. But, when you look at the NRA, they have their own defensive gun use database. They use our numbers at least part of the time. I know that because I made a typo that it was a mark typo. It's the same one I make damn near all the time. And I made it, and I was looking at the NRA's database, and there was my typo. Now, we had already corrected ours because when we went through the verification process, somebody goes, great, he flipped letters again. And so it went away, but it was still on the NRA. So, I think that it's fair to ask the questions, is this a legitimate number? I think that is very fair. I don't think that's a lobbying issue. I think that's just a straight up, if any number in Congress, any number any politician ever says, it should be questioned.
Yeah, I think that, again, I think it's fine to question this stuff or even to speak to the CDC about it. What I think people have a problem with is that this was done in private and that the CDC didn't seek anyone else's point of view.
See, I don't know that. I can only assume that. Do you know that?
Well, the FOIA was for all the communications that were related to this. And
okay. I just don't know. And I don't know what was redacted. I saw that there was a lot of stuff that was redacted, so I have no idea what was in it.
CDC says, I asked them directly. They didn't say that anyone else, they reached out to anyone else. They said they talked to other groups.
They didn't really reach out to me. I was just, I won't say I was drug in because I voluntarily came in, but I would not have considered that a private meeting. It was a Zoom meeting with everybody that keeps records. That's not a private meeting. That's just a meeting.
Well, it wasn't open to the public, is what I mean. The public didn't know this change was happening.
I understand that. I would have considered that nothing more than how to best describe it. If you were to call the CDC and you get on a Zoom meeting with them asking them questions, would you consider that a public meeting or a private meeting?
Well, private, if it's not open to the public. Would you
consider that right or wrong?
Well, look, I'm not saying that you did anything wrong necessarily.
No.
The question is about the process.
Is it a private? Are we using the word private meeting as a derogatory term, or is it just that's how the meeting happened?
I think it's just a description of how it happened.
So, but if you had to call CDC and ask them questions, and you ended up on a Zoom call, would that be a wrong thing if it was? The public was not invited.
Well, no, but I wasn't. But you were advocating for a change, and so if they made that change after only consulting you in private,
well, see, that
seemed to be an issue.
All we knew was we stated a case, and then it disappeared for months.
Right,
and then all of a sudden, I get a note that said, "Oh yeah, we changed this."
Right,
that was it.
Yeah, and I understand that maybe it's not your decision whether the CDC, how it acts, right? I understand that you're on one side.
I told somebody the other night, GVA is a pretty cool group, but we don't have the juice to push the CDC around.
Right. Okay. Well, so just one last segment here, just to go into, you talked about how stats can move public opinion. And that's what you're talking about with the 2.5 million DGUs a year. I think that it's a good transition to talk about the mass shooting counter at GVA, because that's what you guys are most known for, of course. And there are obviously critiques of how you do that. We've discussed it a little bit offline, but I thought it would be good to include it here too, right? So you guys use what has now become sort of the media standard for what mass shooting means, which is 4 or more injured, not including the shooter, right?
Injured or killed, not including the shooter. Yes.
Right. And so this produces a much larger number than a lot of other methodologies, right? Like, for instance, the Associated Press has a different standard. Mother Jones has their own standard. Associated Press is closer. Sort of the older way of looking at mass shootings was 4 or more killed in a single incident. And obviously, if you use the 2 different methodologies, you can get very different numbers. I think, what do you got? What's your number at now? It's over 600.
Right? 620 or something. But see, I think you just did what a lot of folks do. You conflated 2 different subjects as one. There's mass shootings there's mass murders. Mass murders is an FBI definition of 4 or more killed. Now, that could be whether it's a bombing or a shooting or a stabbing or whatever. So
Right.
when Mother Jones and all of them, they derive mass killings, mass murders, and that's 4 or more killed. And that's fine. That's what method. That's why you write a methodology. And if you look at us, we have both numbers up. We have both mass murder and mass shooting because they are 2 different things. To blow off, and I'm not saying you're blowing off, but to blow off thousands of people who are shot each year that by sheer luck they're not dead, that they shouldn't be in this count. We are open kimono on our mass shooting number very intentionally. I want to see everything where there's 4 or more shot or killed on the record, and then you, the blogger, you, the journalist, you, the advocate, can go into those numbers, look at the subcategories, and say, oh, well, that was a drive-by shooting. We're not going to count that. Or that was a domestic violence in a house. We're not going to count that. Even though the same number of people die in the same quantity of victims in the shootings. So that's where we are on it. We are open kimono. We want to say, here's the number. You want to do more research on the number? That's fine. That's what we're here for.
Right. I understand. And I don't think there's anything wrong with keeping track of 4 or more people injured in a shooting. The problem comes with language and how this number gets used in media, which is anytime there is a mass public killing, people will point to that number as though there are everything in there is similar to what has just happened in Uvalde or Parkland or Las Vegas.
I can't make that assumption. I don't know what how people infer. I can't make that.
You haven't seen that?
Oh, I see how people write, but I can't see how the readers infer. That's not. I mean, that would require mind reading on my part.
Sure, but and you probably heard this critique before, but the problem with that count, in my view, is that it lumps in a lot of shootings that are very different from one another. There are different issues that lead to those different kinds of shootings, and so I don't know how valuable it is to lump them together, other than to make people think that something like Uvalde or Buffalo or what have you happens much more often than it does. Which I understand what you mean is like these people still got injured or killed, and that it doesn't mean they don't matter or that we shouldn't think about these issues.
Saying. That's kind of what you're saying, that they don't matter.
It's not at all. But you can't solve. Let me just finish my point, and then I'll give you some time. You can't solve a shootout situation during a drug sale or a shooting into a crowd that's gang related in the same way that you can solve these mass murder incidents that one person commits at a school or in a public place. They're very different problems. I mean, isn't that right? I mean, they certainly require different solutions. And so taking them and lumping them all together, it might be useful data to look at long-term trends. Your data only goes back to 2013. I understand that, that's just the limitation of reality that's when you started studying it, and that's fine. But, I just think rather than add context, it takes context away by putting all these things together as though they're the same problem in society and potentially have the same solutions, which they don't.
But you could make that same argument about any aggregate. But what we look at and what we're very vocal about is there is not a single solution. We have never said there was a single solution. Domestic violence mass shootings, gang mass shootings, a lot of those are all different than going into Aurora Theater or Uvalde. Those are different, and we know that. That's why when you look at the gross number, it has a bunch of subcategories that then provide the texture. Now, do I like that they use the big number and don't give it any context? Not really. but they're going to use the number they're going to use. Whether I made it 3 or more, 7 or more, 2 or more, whatever the number that we pick, somebody's going to have a complaint with it, because it's not going to be a number. And one of the reasons that the gun rights side has a problem with it, and that I've heard verbalized more than one, it really makes you guys look worse. It's just not a good number for you, and I understand that. That's not why it's there, but it doesn't make gun ownership look good, because it makes you see something that maybe it's not really there. And I agree with you. Contextually, mass shootings is a diverse category. We put all those other variables in each individual report. So if you look at mass shootings, you can tell which ones are school shootings, which ones are gang violence, which ones are domestic violence, which ones are bar fights, and the like. So you get but you have to have a base, and our base is just, the word mass shooting. Mass is a measurement of quantity. That's all it is. It's not a measurement of quantity it's just a measurement of quantity. So you have to put the other variables in there to give it context. That's what we do.
Yep. I understand. Just to me, mass shooting, I think for the vast majority of regular people, when they hear that word, they think of the public mass killings.
Well, the ones that I see, they also look at drive-bys. And the guys on the right don't really, and Mother Jones is another example, don't really like talking about drive-bys and gang violence. Different issues, different solutions, and that we all need to look at that there are different solutions, and that needs to be emphasized.
Sure, and I would also apply this critique to the Associated Press's basic count, because, like you mentioned there, the majority of where incidents where 4 or more people are killed in a single shooting are actually domestic violence situations where someone murders their family in their house, which is a different, again, problem than something like Buffalo. We already have enough of those.
We have enough, and that's why that number
be worried about them
is a half inch below the first number. They're on the chart. They are right next to each other.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you coming on and taking the time and having this civil discussion. I think this was productive and fruitful, and I think our audience will enjoy it. And you gave us more time than we asked for, so I can't ask for
no idea how much. Okay, we're close. But yeah, that sounds good to me. I'm happy to if there's any other questions you have, please be. You will find I will answer honestly. You may not like it, I may not like it, but I will answer honestly.
And I appreciate that. That is something we could use a lot more of. And so that's why I'm glad you took this opportunity to come on. Where can people find more about you and GVA if they want to?
Our website is gunviolencearchive.org. And we are also on Facebook. And we're also on that other thing up there that starts with a T that I'm just afraid to even mention it now. So, so we're up there.
Quite turbulent over there.
And all we do with Twitter is we push out stats daily. So it'll be a different set of stats every day. One day will be school shootings. One day will be drive-bys. One day will be.
And we didn't have time to get into this, but what you guys don't just track mass shootings and defensive gun uses, right? There's other stuff too, right? You have a pretty big team.
Mass shootings are 6% of our work. The majority of our work is domestic violence shootings, one-on-one, bar fights, fights outside of bars, and we can get into this gun-free zone argument at some point if you wish. Because of the most of them that happen are not gun-free zone. They happen in a parking lot. They happen on a city street. They happen in a house. They happen in a lot of places. Some are in gun-free zones like a school or a bar. Most aren't. So, we look at all the big numbers, and mass shootings are, again, 6%. That's all they are, both by quantity of incidents and by quantity of victims.
Right. Absolutely. So yeah, people can go and check out presumably the other work that you guys do as well, because I know this gets all the attention, but there's certainly other stuff. So thank you so much for joining us. Perhaps we'll have you on again in the future too.
Let me know. You take care.
Well, we will hopefully see you again. We're going to head over to the news update now. Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right. Now it's time for the news update with contributing writer Jake Fogelman. How are you doing this week, Jake?
I'm doing all right, Steve. How are you?
I'm good. Are you looking forward to Christmas here coming up?
Yeah. Looking forward to getting together with family, having a nice Christmas dinner. It seems like it's going to be pretty wicked cold out here in Colorado for, I don't know if you've heard about this bomb cyclone that's going around the country, but it's supposed to be pretty frigid.
Are you getting snow at least?
I don't think there's going to be much snow, but they said with wind chill, at least the eastern part of Colorado could be -50 on Thursday and Friday. So it's pretty nuts.
You'll have to do one of those videos where you boil water and then throw it outside. And
watch it freeze.
Watch it freeze. That's crazy, man. I'm going up to Pennsylvania to the farm, my mom's farm, and to see the rest of my family. But I think we might get some snow up there.
Nice. White Christmas.
To see. Yeah, that'd be nice. That'd be a nice getaway from DC for a while. Always good to go up to the farm, get some R&R, and see friends and family. So I'm looking forward to that for sure. We're just doing this episode early this week, so that it doesn't come out on Christmas Day. I think people will probably have other things going on rather than listening to the podcast. So I figure we do one a little bit earlier and try to keep people up to date as they go into this holiday season here. I'm not sure. We probably won't do an episode next week either. So just try to combine everything into this week and do the best to keep people up to date before the new year. So in that vein, we've got two stories for everyone this week. Two pretty big developments in gun law on two separate sides of the country, two coastal states. What we got first?
Yeah, so we got a permanent injunction issued first off in the California fee shifting case that we've been covering pretty heavily. This, of course, stems from California's attempt to copy Texas when they passed their bounty-style abortion ban last year. It was Governor Gavin Newsom, once the Supreme Court didn't strike down that law on procedural grounds. He responded with his own version of a law for guns that allows people to sue for assault weapons and ghost guns. But it also creates this crazy fee shifting provision where essentially if you try to sue the state of California over one of their gun laws, you have to be 100% successful on every single one of your claims in your lawsuit in order to, otherwise you have to pay the state your legal fees. You have to cover their attorney's fees. and
your lawyers are also liable.
Right. Yeah.
Which is pretty unique too.
Personally liable, which is obviously a massive disincentive to sue the state.
Right. And it actually did cause some gun rights groups to drop off of certain cases to sort of prioritize which laws they were going to challenge because of this provision. And, that's, by the way, something we predicted was going to happen after Texas passed their law. It was fairly, I think, clear that, at least to me, that this was going to get copied somewhere else and applied to something that Democrats don't like. And so in this case, it was guns. It didn't, And then, of course, the Texas law became moot anyway because the Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade right after they passed this law. But regardless, California went through with sort of spiting Texas and passing this law, which all the officials basically said was unconstitutional. In fact, the Attorney General, Rob Bonta, right, a Democrat in California, he had to remove himself from the case. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, he had to file a brief basically saying he's stepping away because he had a whole stream of past statements on California's law, calling it, and I quote, blatantly unconstitutional. So it's kind of tough to then go and defend a law that, by all accounts, all the California officials admit is a direct copycat of this law that you've called blatantly unconstitutional. So he stepped away.
He was facing potential sanctions from the court if he didn't do that because
that's right.
The gun rights groups out there, I think it was specifically California Rifle and Pistol Association, had filed a motion that could have resulted in sanctions for him if he hadn't stepped away.
That's right.
So, pretty embarrassing all around, I think. for California officials in this case. But how's the governor spinning this, by the way?
I was going to say, he doesn't seem to be taking it as very embarrassing. He put out a statement pretty soon after the ruling got handed down, basically saying he thanked Judge Roger Benitez, by the way, was the judge that handed down this injunction. Listeners may know him from several previous gun cases out of California where he's ruled against the state's gun laws in the past. But he put out a statement saying, thank you, Judge Benitez. We've been saying all along that Texas's anti-abortion law is outrageous. Basically, he just framed it as a indictment of Texas's abortion law, even though this case very specifically dealt with California's version, which Benitez, even in his opinion, drew a distinction between California's law and Texas's law because the fee shifting provision is a little more extreme in California's case. So he's pretty defiant about the whole thing, to be honest.
Yeah, he sort of took this tone of, well, this was why we passed the law in the first place, to get it declared unconstitutional. I think there's a couple problems with that point of view, though, or that argument, which is, for one, just like Rob Bonta, who stepped away because he couldn't defend the law because he thought it was unconstitutional. Well, in the lead up to that decision, he had gone around trying to avoid challenges to this law. He tried to moot them ahead of time by effectively declaring that the state wouldn't pursue damages in any of the gun cases that were already in front of them, as a way of trying to avoid judges looking at this. Of course, Benitez is sort of famously, averse to California's legal tricks or legal maneuvering when it comes to gun cases. He's ruled against a number of their gun laws, so he didn't buy this sort of attempt to sidestep the issue, and so he ruled the way that, like, everyone would expect it to happen. I think one of the issues with this was just like the issue in the Texas case, is that it's there weren't any attempts to actually enforce this law, so it made it hard to challenge it. It's much harder to challenge something when there isn't an attempt to enforce it, right? So, but Benitez, I think, got fed up with the game of them, of them trying to pass the buck on this law, and just decided to go through with a case against it. And it is probably bad news for the Texas law too, I would assume, but it's a little odd to go out. I mean, I think one of the main complaints that that California had about this case getting heard at all was that they wanted to wait until Texas's law got declared unconstitutional before their law. It's like, it's not how things work.
That's not how it works.
It's
yeah.
not how it works. It's like that old Geico ad or whatever. It's not how any of this works. So they wanted to. It seemed pretty clear to me that if a judge had upheld the Texas law, that then California would switch their tune to saying, well, it is constitutional now, and then they would try to enforce it. So, they're being a bit disingenuous, it feels like, California officials on this one. But yeah, so now, I guess it doesn't seem likely they're going to appeal this decision, does it?
I wouldn't assume, based on that statement, that sort of celebratory statement from Newsom. Right. He wasn't outraged at all by the decision. He just sort of took it as him spiking the football that his culture war symbol turned on Texas, I guess. So
it's like celebrating that he passed an unconstitutional law, basically.
Right. And
so
wasted
I knew
taxpayer
it was
money.
Unconstitutional, and I passed it anyway.
Right.
Like, okay.
Exactly.
It's not really a win. It doesn't feel like a win from the outside here, but okay. Obviously I get the philosophical point that they don't like Texas's law, and that's fair, but passing a law is unconstitutional is it doesn't seem like a win. Either way, that's not the only thing that's happened this week. On the other side of the country, in New Jersey, we had a significant development as well. What happened there?
Yeah, so we finally have our second state to pass a quote-unquote Bruin response bill, basically a state that was formerly may issue, that was affected by the Supreme Court's ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin, striking down basically subjective carry laws that don't allow it didn't allow the issuing of permits on objective grounds.
May issue laws is what we call them, right?
Right. And so obviously New York was at hand in that case, and they responded pretty quickly with their wide-ranging, sweeping, restricting concealed carry law that's been in and out of courts for the last few months that we've been covering. But up until this point, no other states had joined them in that pursuit.
Right.
Until
California
yesterday.
tried, but couldn't quite get across the line.
Yeah, they got too aggressive and tried to pass a special immediate emergency bill, and it cost them. But now we have New Jersey actually officially, the legislature at least, has officially passed a Bruin response bill. As of recording this podcast, Governor Phil Murphy has yet to sign the bill into law, but we all expect that he's going to do so. And it's pretty similar to the New York law. I think there's over 20 quote unquote sensitive places where even licensed carry will be illegal. There's a whole bunch of new background checks. You have to get extra references that can't be family members. You have to have people that can speak to your character during the application process. They upped the application fees to $200 just to apply, plus an additional, I believe, $50 to have your permit issued. So a total of $250 just for the application portion. They added a bunch of training requirements to include both in-person classroom training and live fire range training. And probably one of the bigger, more controversial additions that isn't in the New York law is the requirement for insurance. For if you want to carry in public, they say you have to have minimum liability insurance, a policy that covers up to $300,000 in quote unquote injury and death, which is a little interesting because it creates a sort of
whose injury and death. I mean, like, are you trying to cover people for criminal acts?
Right.
Because obviously you
That's
can't
the hang
do
up.
that.
Yeah.
This is the same sort of idea that we've covered in the past with was it San Jose?
Yep, that's right.
Out in California, that is trying to require insurance for gun ownership. I mean, honestly, none of these things seem very long for this world in the wake of Bruin. They also have the private property
That's right.
ban as well. Basically it applies to public accessible private property. So things like stores or restaurants. In the entire history of the country, in every state up to this point, the rule had been that private property owners can ban people from carrying on their property if they so choose to, but they have to post a sign to let people know that they're doing that. And so New York's and New Jersey's innovation here is just to flip the whole thing on its head. It's illegal. Not only is it off limits, it's a felony,
Right.
to carry on private property unless it's posted that you can. Most of these controversial provisions that New Jersey has now passed into law were already been struck down by judges in New York. They are all enforced right now in New York because the Second Circuit is waiting to hear an appeal to those decisions. But 3 different federal judges in New York, I believe, or is 3 different judges, if I'm remembering that correctly. It's either 2 or 3. There's several cases, and it's like 3 or 4 cases, but have struck down a bunch of different portions of New York's law. It does feel like they just want to get right back to the Supreme Court to lose again. There's some of this stuff you can argue over. It's a novel approach, so maybe there's some room for error here or some possibility that these things hold up. But so much of this is just a direct sort of middle finger to the Supreme Court, to be honest with you. Yeah. It just doesn't seem like there's a lot of actual wiggle room in any of this stuff, because it's just trying to go directly against what the court ruled in Bruin. And I don't see how it doesn't just end up back at the Supreme Court for another sort of round of getting these laws struck down. Unless it just doesn't make it that far.
Right.
Like they could lose at the lower courts, which have been fairly faithful to the Bruin decision in reviewing these specific laws so far. But yeah, it's kind of shocking in a certain way. We've talked about this before with New York, but I think my analysis piece at one point was called "Thank You, Sir, May I Have Another?" Right? That's what New York is telling the court. Like it's like they want to have these laws struck down because they're just so blatantly against what the court had ruled, especially stuff like the private property ban or the sensitive places expansions to be almost everywhere. Right? It's like it's harder to legally carry a gun in New York now than it was before the Bruin rule.
Right.
Like, and I don't know who thinks that's going to hold up. You know what I mean? Like it's one thing to say, well, maybe some of these other laws unrelated to gun carry will stand, like a permit to purchase law in the Oregon ballot initiative, right? Like it's sort of like a shall issue gun carry law. So maybe that'll be acceptable, even if it doesn't have a historical analog because of, the way that Kavanaugh and Roberts had approved of shall issue permitting regimes and Bruins in the concurrence. And you can get into this stuff about, all right, well, how far is this going to go? What laws are going to be found to have historical analogs? But these carry laws in New Jersey and New York, and probably in California next year sometime, are going to, like, it's just, there's not really much room to have some sort of nuanced conversation about them. They are just kind of the exact things that Bruin said you can't do.
And you sort of saw this with some of the lawmaker deliberation while this bill was being debated, because this was like a 2-month process in New Jersey. But you heard, time and time again from Democratic lawmakers that were supporting this bill saying, well, we know that I'm sure there's going to be a ton of legal challenges as soon as we pass this. And, we're going right at the Supreme Court. And it seems like they're well aware that this is just inviting, a new onslaught of challenges that they're probably going to lose, but they just do it anyway.
It's very odd. It does remind me, I will say, of how some cities operate in, red states or purple states. Philadelphia comes to mind, obviously, where they're sort of constantly passing gun restrictions that are not legal under state law and constantly losing in court. They do this basically a couple times a year, actually, usually, and they seem unperturbed by the fact that they're always losing. They seem to know that they can't do this stuff, and they just do it anyway. And the only reason, why you would go about that is if it were politically popular, or at least not politically unpopular, I guess.
Yeah.
And so I get, it's probably not that unpopular for New York and New Jersey lawmakers to give a middle finger to the Supreme Court on this issue, because in their states, while there are millions of gun owners in both states, it's they're very deep blue states that just, I don't know, I guess they like the idea of fighting the court on this issue or what have you, but it's these don't strike me as serious attempts to respond to the ruling. They just strike me as things that are, I guess, political messaging at the cost of a lot of taxpayer money and time for those affected by the laws. So I don't know. We'll see how it plays out. Maybe I'm wrong, right? Maybe the court gets bored and doesn't go back to this issue or something. That's like the only hope I could see for these laws surviving very long, is just the court kind of goes back into its 10-year hibernation on gun issues and just never takes up a case like this. But I don't know. I could see these laws turning out just like Sertano did in 2016, where it was just a 2-page opinion where they're like, this is obviously against what we had ruled. Right. You can't do this. And it was unanimous. Like that wouldn't shock me. So we'll see. We'll have to, of course, keep an eye on how these things develop. But in the meantime, of course, this is going to affect people who live in New Jersey and want to carry a firearm. Unfortunately, for those of you who are in that position, you will probably win out in the end, but it's probably going to take a while.
I think that's the most unfortunate part, because unlike New York, who passed theirs right away, there's a few-month gap where people in New Jersey, they weren't enforcing their justifiable need clause, but they also didn't have this sweeping restrictive law. So it's kind of unfortunate for folks that were finally looking for a chance to get a carry permit in New Jersey.
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if things play out like they did in New York, where you get lower district courts ruling different portions, different provisions of this law are unconstitutional, and then that goes into effect for a week, and then the appeals court issues a stay until they hear the case, and then we'll have to see what the appeals court actually does with it. But it sort of feels a bit like a delaying tactic is what I think we're seeing in the Second Circuit with New York's cases. But we will cover it all. We will certainly be here to give updates, and maybe it goes in a direction that I'm not expecting. That's always possible. So either way, that's all we've got for you this week. If you like the show, please rate and share it. Whatever you're listening to this on, your favorite podcasting app, or watching it on YouTube, give us a thumbs up or a 5-star rating and a little review. It helps grow the audience. Share it with your friends, of course. And if you want more from us, you can go and sign up for our newsletter over at thereload.com. It's a free weekly newsletter. And if you really like the reporting that we do, you can, of course, buy a membership. That's how we fund our journalism here at The Reload, through memberships, through subscribers. So head on over to thereload.com and check out the options today. But we will see you guys again real soon.